Hello, my name is Simone Fischer, and I have the honor today of sitting with Bernardo Valerino on your current solo exhibition, Heart on Guns, Gold, and God, here at the Arlington Museum of Art. Thank you so much. So, let's get started. Can you talk a little bit about the title of your exhibition, Heart on Guns, Gold, and God, for an audience who might not be familiar with your current body of work?
Sure. So this came about our conversation with the museum. They were looking for a show that merged with their theme of legacy. And I was thinking of how to bring that forth, right? So as I'm thinking about legacy is something that connects the past into a conversation in the present and then possibly move us to the future. That's kind of how I interpret it. And I was looking at my work in that manner. So as I'm looking to the future, as I'm looking at the things that I'm wanting to work on, there are some themes that appear both just recently in my work regarding religion, and then all their elements also from the past are going to be much more obvious in the future. So guns, for sure, is something that's coming up, but it's at the same time at the core are a lot of the things that I have addressed in the past with my work. Gold, I use a lot of elements related to preciousness, so metals, gold very specifically in many cases, and then God. It's just a way for us to be retrospective or introspective, I should say, on our own beliefs, whether those are religious or other kinds of beliefs. But specifically, obviously, with the work here at the AMA, definitely a much more God-related element.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, when the viewers come into this exhibition, they're met with, sculpture, installation, 2D work, 3D work. And so can you describe the process and criteria for creating the artwork selected for this exhibition? And how does your conceptual framework of what you just described dictate various mediums seen within the exhibition? So what calls for the sculpture of a figure or the painting of a figure? How do you work this out through the creation of this work?
That's a great question. I mean, there's many different ways. However, each artwork, it's on its own, and I begin from a very neutral element, and then I start looking at what best describes and what best informs the conversation that I'm trying to create with the work. So I bring forth a lot of the elements of both artistic elements, scale, plurality, etc., as well as aesthetic elements, right? And lastly, but very importantly, is the material. I use material very, very mindfully on how materials themselves, because they're charged with meaning, right? They can be used as vessels to describe, to create a conversation, and also to basically become a vocabulary on what I'm trying to say. So in this specific case, what I was wanting to do is I was wanting to look at pieces of artwork from the past that were very much informative on the way that I am kind of moving forward with my work, right? So different things that you have seen from different bodies of work, from different series, and then kind of choosing an artwork from different ones as evidence in some ways of where things are going in from this point forward, right? With the new works that are coming up, they're very much related about guns. So that's how they were chosen. Now the new body of work, the new elements that are part of what I'm starting to work on, those are in so many ways samples, like the first or the second on each one of those series.
Like a prototype.
Exactly. And even more than a prototype, I would say they're more actual complete works, one of many to come or a few to come. So, yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think when I come into this exhibition, I am indelibly struck by the socially charged and sexually charged nature and the manifestations of this work. But beyond these, you have torsos, which is very similar to, the way that the Greeks had torsos, and you have these nods to classical art, but then you're also kind of mitigating that with the contemporary issues that you see around you as an artist. So balancing that preciousness of human life, how do you use these themes as a form of social critique or, acquisitions of power through your visual lexicon? So how do you temper, looking at the strength of whether that be social issues around violence or sexuality, but then you have like this tenderness as well. So can you talk about that tension within the work?
Mm-hmm. So it's very mindful. I've always have been extremely careful on how I describe the lives, the stories, the background of individuals, because I am talking about people's lives. Mm-hmm. So I'm always very, very mindful on how to create a balance between the context of the social commentary, which tends to be a lot of times political and very harsh, with the reality of the lives, right, and the stories, right? So how do you create a balance, and how do you make artwork that is both seductive visually, but at the same time that it has teeth and claws, mm-hmm. right? That it can actually engage people, mm-hmm. and that's always something that I strive to. So the sensitivity of the subject matter as well as the material gets slowly combined alongside the much stronger commentary, hopefully to create a bridge for conversations, mm-hmm. right? And the cool thing about it being a multidisciplinary artist, somebody that engages both sculpturally, two-dimensionally, and so forth, allows me not to be attached to one single way of creating artwork. Mm-hmm. So when I'm able to borrow from, classical history, as well as surrealism, as well as contemporary art, I'm able to kind of pull in as necessary, mm-hmm. To fulfill that commentary, to fulfill that conversation, to fulfill that bridge. Yes. So that's kind of how it works. I mean, it sounds complicated, obviously, but really in the studio, it doesn't. I think from practice of building sculptures and kind of being around, I think, the creating of this kind of artwork, I've gotten better at it.
Yes, well, and also, I feel like, we as artists, we don't live in a vacuum, mm-hmm. right? And from a previous conversation we had, you talked about being a bacteria and how, artists are absorbing what is around us, you know what I mean? And that impacts the work as well. And so I think that is a really important aspect of kind of, you're not just making art from a decorative standpoint. You have something to say. So I think that there are many different conversations happening here, but what would you pinpoint in terms of like the transition to this new body of work? Between all of this, like you could say that this cacophony of conversation, what is the pinpoint of transition for you?
So as you said, I don't think I have a strong voice. Like my voice really doesn't come out through the artwork specifically. I tend and I try really hard to create artworks that are more questions than answers, right? So regardless, obviously there is my own perspective, my own bias as I'm creating artwork, but I really strive to create questions, right? So as you look around in the different sculptures and the different artworks and installations, you'll see that's what you're going to be encountered with. Mm-hmm. It's a question. It's up to the person who is conversing or communing with the artwork to be able to have the conversation with themselves, with somebody else, mm-hmm. or at least be posed with a conversation. Mm-hmm. And the conversation that is changing from what it was before to what it's now is I have been really highlighting the stories, the individuals, the victim, right? And throughout that study, not indulging either, that's just kind of the wrong word, but being around it for so much and looking at what the origin, beginning, part of the violence, what creates the violence, what fuels the violence, all those things. Guns have kind of come up over and over and over again, whether it is, we're talking about individuals who have been displaced by violence from their homes, or we're talking about direct victims of violence, like with Pedacitos de Paz, and so forth and so on. Guns tend to come up. So now my questions, the center point of what's coming is I want to create questions around our global cultural, around guns, the conversations that we're having about guns, our approach to them, and how is it that we are interacting with them in a social context.
And I think your work on Pasito de la Paz, is that right? I think that's what struck me personally, because I loved how you took this really complicated question, right? And I don't think you have an answer for it, but you took this complicated question and you quantified it through the delicacy of a ribbon. And for me, that creates this tenderness that I keep coming back to, because I think it's really easy to kind of get down into this, like, there are no answers, this kind of like nihilism of some sort, which I feel like is kind of counterintuitive to the work. But can you talk a bit how this preciousness operates, whether it's through the ribbon, through your collaboration with others, which I think is another form of intimacy with your audience, and also the gilded nature of like what does that tenderness, that delicacy, and the gilded, what does all that point to in terms of the context of this like huge question of violence, both nationally and globally?
It's actually a very simple answer, to be honest, because it's just the value of human life.
Yes.
It just comes down to the individual and that life, and how the preciousness that exists within that individual, and the value that they have, right? And we as humans believe strongly in that value. I mean, we have laws, we have religious context, everything that talks about the value of human life. So really, when it comes down to it, everything just boils down to that, the preciousness of humanity, of the human life. So that's it.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think, I'm struck by the feminine figure that is like arguably one of the forefronts of this exhibition. And you place her in the center. And as we talked about, I would argue she's one of the most phallic structures of this, like giving her that power that despite this violence that's relative to a masculine toxicity, I feel like, you recognize the humanity, whether that be in Hebrew, whether that be in Arabic. And so, how do you tread those lines in terms of being subversive without speaking for an entire community? Like, as a visual artist, what do you think your role is in all that?
It's a internal conversation and consumption of what's going around us, while being honest and truth about my own experience and not overposing my own experience in somebody else's. It sounds difficult to be able to do that, but you just have to listen. And I would say also take on an honest approach to when you are dealing with those with things that are beyond my own experience, right? So obviously, I am not a cis female, so I have no idea what it feels like to have the preciousness of society as a female, right? However, as a human person, as a human life, as a person who does have other elements in where I have been oppressed, whether it is because of my sexuality, because of my being an immigrant, also a dry country person, all of those things I can convey some of my own experiences, be empathetic to somebody else's, and try from my perspective kind of move things around in some ways, to be able to converse in that vocabulary without being like directly on their shoes.
Yes.
And you see that throughout the work, I think, like with the different prayer beads, yes. Right? I started with a Catholic one, being myself Catholic, mm-hmm. and Christian, and then seeing how the beads are also relevant and used in many other cultures. Mm-hmm. So because I do have the relationship with the beads from the Catholic mm-hmm. perspective, then I feel more comfortable applying that as a religious object, yes. into other religions, right? Yes. So that's kind of how that works. There's not so much a permission, but there is a path mm-hmm. to be able to.
And I think it's really interesting how, touching on the prayer beads or the malas, you also have these other kind of touchstones of culture, how, and they're not just prayer beads, they're made of soybeans, mm-hmm. they're made of coffee beans. Mm-hmm. So there's this aspect of commerce, consumption, and resource as well. But also, usually you would see traditionally in like Catholicism, Mary, but you see a butterfly. So is that to bring a type of universal theme to it, to broaden it beyond just the context of your own vantage point? Mm-hmm. Or how are these butterflies and these materials of consumption or commerce operating within, that held meaning of prayer beads or a rosary or a mala?
Mm-hmm. Well, simple. I think the element of it is identity. Mm-hmm. We can describe a group of people who are diverse themselves by what they eat, what they consume, mm-hmm. right? So, I use materials very stereotypically, the most common denominator, in order to convey context. So that's why I'm using, let's say, for example, beans to kind of convey a sense of like Western world, whether, and in Catholicism or Christianism, around the context of beans. Right. So the idea is to almost convey a sense of individualism or a person on each one of those beans within the same kind of much larger context of a Christian or an Hindi or a Muslim and so forth.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also a question of globalization too that's happening in terms of how commerce, interestingly, like what is the price of human life? I think that in the simple gesture of a soybean or a coffee bean, I think there's so much meaning both culturally across, everything that feels like very personal. So I think you kind of tread that line in terms of these highly debatable topics, but then again, you always temper it with that love. And I think that really comes through in terms of tenderness versus, but I feel like there's also other aspects of intimacy that you subvert, like with the peepholes, when you're like looking in and you're seeing soldiers, that is also, they are combined, I don't want to give it away, with, like this like sexual tension and how violence is also wrapped in that. So can you talk about like, how do you tread those lines in terms of being subversive, but also kind of tongue in cheek? I think there's a humor in it that yes. I don't want to diminish that, because I feel like there's an aspect of humor in your work that is absolutely an undertone of this exhibition.
Yeah. There's a levity that I always try to, I want to go deep into the subject matter, but try to also have a little bit of levity, a little bit of tongue in cheek, like you mentioned. Mm-hmm. When we talk about like the preciousness, when we talk about gold, when we talk about the preciousness and the value and the conversation about value, it's one of those other balances or scales that are part of the work, right? So you'll see that conversation of value. So in the title, for example, of guns, gold, and God. When talking about gold, we're talking about that specific element, like our relationship with the value of a human life, mm-hmm. right? So, and then in regard to the What was the other question? What was the other part of the question?
So the other part of the question was, I ended on humor, but also, how that, I'm going to say kind of freestyle here, but I feel like that is also like a way to acquiesce power, because you're able to point out the absurdity of it.
Yes.
And I feel like, can we talk a little bit about the absurdity of this violence? Because everyone gets very serious, and it is very serious. That's not to diminish,
for sure.
but also it's absolutely absurd when you step back. So can you talk about that a little bit?
It's very much so, and it's funny. It's funny, not funny, but like I said, that levity that exists, it comes from, looking at Catalan's work, for example, where he uses this comedy around very strong subject matter, a very heavy subject matter. So there is some elements as well in the work that and always have. I just how a little bit of comedy or tongue-in-cheek in some cases helps with that and bringing up the absurdity for sure, whether it's a numbers scale, using elements of our principles of design to kind of enhance that some.
Yeah, and also kind of like poke at the power, right? Because they always say comedians are, that's what would make a person of power the most mad is, I think humor is honestly another way to reclaim power, that like you do have influence, you do have sway, and you can be a part of hopefully a shift to where we were talking about, where maybe one day this work will be irrelevant. You know what I mean? Yeah. But right now, you absorb your surroundings and the cultural context. So can you talk a little bit about that relevancy in terms of like, because we talked about this being not a retrospect, but a future spect. How all of these works operate as different trajectories on a parallel course. Right. So what would be kind of like your goal in terms of that relevance of what this might look like in 10 years, like looking back? I know this is like maybe more of a rhetorical question.
No, not at all. It's hard to predict the future and to see exactly where things will be at. Unfortunately, with the experience of my work that I've done for the last 10 years, the relevance just continues to be relevant. Does that even make sense? It's like I create works that, are triggered by an experience that were probably 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and then you bring the work forward and present and still relevant, right? So I'm guessing that my work related to guns, unless something dramatic changes in the world, would be relevant in 10 years, right? Whether we're discussing, it's all going to be about guns, and it's all going to be discussed through the lens of the word fetish, right? It's going to be more about how strong or light the questions will be with each work, right? And so I'm hoping that depending on the audience, the questions are going to be have extra exclamation points right next to the question. Not because I want to say something specific, not that I want to sway specifically one way or the other, but I do want it to resonate quite strongly. Unlike with the other works before, guns have no feelings, so I'm able to put a lot more pressure on the conversation.
Yeah, and I think that has a major aspect of vulnerability in it, both for yourself as a visual artist, but also for our audience. Because I feel like sometimes we just want to not think about it, because that's how we survive. But I think at the root of this is all about vulnerability in terms of maybe just having a vulnerable conversation. So, and that way, I hope it never becomes irrelevant. But
well, keeping wounds open in such a way, right? The conversations, these things really maintain that ability to possibly change things and move things forward, and we as humans really try to shield ourselves from the truth. Because it's painful sometimes, right? So you're just kind of alluring to that. That's why in so many cases I feel like my work is very surrealistic. It's because I do believe that we live in a world where we walk around with like rose-colored glasses. We live in a surreal world where the real world we ignore. So I'm hoping that my artwork in some way becomes a snapping point from
or a catalyst.
Yes, of like going from like our reality of what we live in to the reality that we truly are around.
Mm-hmm. Well, in that way, I think the work is definitely operating to our, reality that often, like you say, feels absolutely surreal. Especially with like media consumption and all of these. But I love that when you talk about you're not here to answer any questions but pose them, because that is the work. That's the job of us as artists.
Yeah, we consume our reality around us. We compress it. We process it, and then through art we're able to convey it back to the world. And I think it's a very important, and it's a high mandate for artists. Our responsibility to be mirrors of society, to bring those questions forth and to have these conversations, to recognize where we are as humans, right? To kind of a temperature check or a reality of where we are.
No, absolutely. And while we're on that point, who you've mentioned a couple artists, but who are the artists that you feel like you're in conversation with, and not just artists, but critics, scholars. Who else do you feel in conversation with in terms of like the contemporary context of this work as a conceptual artist?
Yeah. So I look into different things. So socially, I like to keep my ears out. So I listen to a lot of public radio, a lot of podcasts. Yeah. Regarding the subject matter that I address in my works. But when it comes down to a conversation contemporarily speaking, I'm very intrigued on first my attachment to a classical artist, which sounds kind of cliche, but Salvador Dali.
Yes.
You were talking earlier about like classical elements and classical approach. That a little comes from that, and my own context of surrealism and what I mentioned earlier. But then more contemporarily speaking, I think that I've always been very attracted to the way that Doris Salcedo approaches her work, and I not only materiality but also different other aspects, and I find myself kind of in the same realm, in slightly in a different manner and different perspective. But yeah, she's another artist that I follow closely. Ai Weiwei is somebody else also that definitely influences a lot of things that I do. And not so much influences, but I'm aware of what where he's done and where he's going and things like that. And then it kind of helps me keep a pulse on if I'm doing things right, kind of thing. But yeah, I'm trying to think who else. Felix.
Felix Gonzalez Torres.
Yes, thank you. I always mix all their last
names.
Yeah, so he's another artist that
or Torres Gonzalez. I did the same thing. Excuse me. Yeah, Felix. We can go by first name. We're good friends.
And then last but not least, I'm trying to think who else. I mean, there's other artists as well, but I think those are the main ones that I'm constantly kind of thinking of, addressing, and been in conversation with more.
Yeah, because I feel like there's a whole canon of that drives this specific type of contemporary art, whether that's Felix, whether that's Hank Williams Thomas. Like there are a lot of artists asking these questions from the vantage point of their own communities, and so I think this contribution is also really important to that everlasting conversation on how art is a driver of potential social change. And thank you for asking the hard questions and proposing that to our audiences.
That's what I love to do.
Yes, absolutely.
Cool.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.